All right, I think I'll get started here today. So hopefully you're in the right place. Hopefully I'm in the right place. Eco 100, right? Okay, section 1, right? This is our first lecture. So today I'm going to do the usual thing. So it just occurred to me right this very second that a lot of you might be in a college classroom for the very first time, right? So I hope I hope I don't ruin it for you here. So I'm just going to do the usual thing, and that's just kind of talk a little bit about what we do in this course, what the requirements are, prerequisites, course materials, and all of that stuff. As it happens, another priority of mine is to not stress you out too much. Nothing really happens before Labor Day. So we have like kind of this class and then a little bit of about a week before we really get into what's going on. So no stress, nobody gets hurt today, I hope. So that having been said, there is a little bit of stuff I've put up on our class materials that you can look at. We have a textbook, I'll get into that, and I put up a homework there, which really isn't a homework. It's really, can you just log into the system and click and, that sort of thing. Point to things and click on them and all that. Okay, so anyways, that having been said, welcome. My name is Matthew Baker. Let's see, I've been at Hunter now since I guess 2007, right? Prior to that, I was at the United States Naval Academy for 6 years as a faculty member. Prior to that, I was a student at the University of Connecticut, right? Which is where I'm from originally, right? Northeastern Connecticut, not the Greenwich part of Connecticut. So go Huskies, that's my alma mater there. I tend to, one thing that you'll probably pick up as the course progresses is that I have somewhat eclectic interests. My research typically falls in these fields here, economic anthropology. What is that? Well, maybe you'll find out during the course of the semester. Law and economics. The other class I teach at Hunter is history of economic thought, which is the development of economic thought over the past couple of millennia, I guess. And most of my research nowadays deals with econometric methods. What are those, right? We'll learn. But that is, suffice it to say, statistical techniques applied to problems of interest in the previous three things I described there. Prerequisites, there really aren't any. You have to be able to add and subtract and maybe understand how a graph works. Those are really the big things. Any tools that we need we'll sort of pick up as we go along. So there isn't much more than that. So maybe what I'll do is I'll just dive right in. I'm in the back of my mind, I'm thinking maybe I can, get through all this and get you out of the class a little bit early today. I know that's often expected, so we'll see here. So let's just dive right into this syllabus. Before I get to that, let me actually look at the syllabus here. We'll do this. So you'll notice that the syllabus here is online, and I'm going to show you a couple of different places where you can find it, one of which is Blackboard. Right? If you go to Blackboard, there's a link to this syllabus where everything you need to know about the class can be found here. So I actually forgot to do one thing here. I'm going to have to do it in a second. We have here a general description of the course, which will serve as a reminder. I'm actually going to talk about that a little bit more. And we have here the key things that you need to know, maybe for today. The course Top Hat registration code. I'll get into that in a second. And where you can find this thing called Top Hat, right? That is the system we use for this course. That's where you find all the readings. That's where you'll find all homework. And even a component of our exams will all work through this Top Hat system. There's the usual stuff there. Here's kind of what I just said. In terms of grading, the way we set up the course is we typically have 3 exams roughly evenly spaced throughout the semester. And we go through this whole thing where a week before an exam, we have a practice exam. I assign it. The class before the exam, we go over the practice exam, and then so it's kind of like a dress rehearsal and then an exam. And we basically cycle through that 3 times a semester, right? okay? At the exam date, I give you up until the exam date, in fact, a little bit past it, right, to do any homework. But then we kind of say, all right, there's a third of the class. That's a cycle. Let's move on to the next cycle. And that's kind of the rhythm of the class. 1, 2, 3, right? You'll also notice here that we have homework. I don't really have, I put quizzes in there. I give some quizzes occasionally, but they're usually never for your grade. They're just kind of just for your interest. And I also do that by way of taking attendance at sometimes. So I have a couple ways of doing this attendance thing, one of which is through Top Hat, and the other is through this software called Gradescope, which is kind of my, once again, it's the first day. We have a week off before our next class. Let's not get stressed out about things like that. Gradescope is another thing we'll use, but I can mostly handle that on my own. And I do take attendance and count attendance. And it's funny, this is something, also my habit of making videos here, recording the class. This is something that happened during the pandemic when, like I guess almost everybody, I taught my class online. It sucked. It was terrible. And I realized that there's just something special about being here, not only for you, but for me, right? It's in fact, the videos do this as well. They sort of focus me on what I'm trying to do and on what I'm saying, and I get to see, how you're interacting with the material. And indeed, I like to, as much as we can in a big class like this, have discussions and take questions and all of that stuff. Okay, so that's one reason why I'm taking attendance, is mainly just to encourage you to be here and get used to this being your time to think about this subject and maybe to nudge you in that direction a little bit. So, you can look at the topics here, and really for the point of emphasis right now, you can just kind of see that this is how it works. 8 lectures about, then an exam, another 8 or so lectures, then another exam, and then, the final exam. One thing about the exams is I have been experimenting with doing a quick in-class component and then an online component, and that seems to be working. And once again, we'll see how all of this works because we have practice exams and things of that nature to work with. Okay, in terms of getting in touch with me, you can see on my syllabus, I have some office hours here. They're 10:30 to 12, 10:30 to 11:30, Wednesday and Tuesday, so those are our off teaching days. I'm also here today, I'm here today and Monday, and I'm generally around business hours, kind of, 9 to 3 or 4. I do have 3 kids. You'll hear a lot about them for better or for worse during the course of the semester. And so I do have to kind of be home. But other than that, if I'm around, you can drop by, you can fire me an email and say, hey, I didn't get this or I didn't get that. I'd like to come by and chat. Or you can just come by and chat about the economics major, minor, whatever. That's fine. The very best way to get in touch with me is via that email address there. Let's see here. Oh, some other things. I am in the habit of, and I'll show you this in a second, I am in the habit of videotaping or video recording all of my lectures, and then I post them online on YouTube and all that stuff, and then you can go back and review them and all of that. I'll show you how this works in a second. The caveat there is that you shouldn't rely on them, right? That is to say, you shouldn't say, I'm going to miss class today because I can just watch the video. But you can use them to figure out what's going on in class and maybe to go over material. My greatest hits are the exam reviews, which I tend to think are the most boring, but people like those. So I do put that up there. Let me just quickly do something here and show you this something about how the class works here. I know this makes for scintillating viewing on the, all right, let's see here. Okay, so I think I got it under control here. Okay, so this is kind of what you'll see when you go to Top Hat. The first thing you just go and you sign up. I think it costs about $75. I guess that's relatively cheap in the grand scheme of things. The good news is, across our economics department, across some other departments, if you buy the Top Hat, if you buy access to Top Hat once, it should be the case that it's either free or there's a nominal fee to use it again. So, for example, I use it in my history of economic thought class, and I believe it costs $5 for the semester if you've already have access. So, 75, I guess, I don't know if it's a lot or a little. I guess in the modern world of textbooks, not that much. But suffice it to say that everything that we do can be found on this site. Readings, homework, all of that. So you log in. This is the very first thing you see. Let's see if I enter the class here. I didn't check to make sure all this was working beforehand, but you should see something like this, right? There's the course information thing I have up there. It just occurred to me I should have a link to the syllabus here. I'll add that later. You can see here I have a homework folder, and there's a homework there for you. You'll notice that the due date is October 2nd, right? That'll be right around the time that I'm, first exam-y time. It could be, plus or minus 5 days. I don't know. And you'll also see here the textbook where you can look at our text, and maybe you'll notice that it's custom designed for you, the Hunter student, right? And indeed, in the past couple of years, this is something we've been doing as a department, is making an effort to tailor our Eco 100 class to our students, right? Both in terms of subject matter and in terms of just making it easier to use. And so I have this reading here, Economic Forces, where, sorry, I didn't mean to show all the answers there. Shouldn't be happening. Anyway. Okay, so back to this course information thing. This is, I guess you could say, the course matrix. And as the course goes along, I sort of populate it. And you can see here there's a date. That's today. Lecture notes, that goes to it's a link to my slides up there. And then once the class is over, I'll upload the recording and put it there. I'll make a link to a YouTube. And then there's just some materials there. Now, one of the things I'll say is, one of the things I can say about this is, you do have I was wondering, what is this thing on the side here? ACE, get out of here. I don't know what that is. One of the things I'll say about this is I believe you get a 2-week free trial period with Top Hat. Eventually you'll have to get the whole thing going and pay for it and all of that. But really, if there's one thing that the homework, you don't have to rush off and do it right away. You can see it there, and it's very just kind of, it's pretty simple stuff. Just get used to the system. Not urgent right now, but something that maybe you can think about doing. Anything else on all of this? Let's see. Syllabus, I have to link that. Mental note to self. So one thing about grades, there is this thing, the grade book here on Top Hat. It's pretty clumsy. So I generally try to, I use it to collect grades, but then I kind of use Blackboard, which is a little bit better, to actually assemble your grades as the semester goes along. So I compute kind of a running average, right? After an exam, a couple of homeworks, I get them all into Blackboard and say, this is your numerical average as of today. So, all right, and once again, I'm trying to think of everything here, but it's probably not that necessary. Anything else on the syllabus? Talked about Top Hat, assessment, the course outline. I think we're good. And okay, so one last thing here about contact. As you can see, this is a big class. I have another class about the same size. And it's just me, right? I don't have a TA. I don't have, a lot of help in running the class beyond my finely tuned system and my my software. So there is one thing I will do is sort of plead with you to help me along and help my system run. And part of this is just, trying to at least meet me halfway with certain things. So one example is the best way to reach me is via email, but please spend a little bit of time making your email. Understand that I have a lot of students, and I get irritated if I have to do detective work to figure out what's going on with your email. So here I have an example of what not to do and what to do with your email. I get a lot of them that look like this. No punctuation, all lowercase, from a random name, right? I don't know who that is, and my example is, obviously something like this. More on that in a second. I don't know what class you're talking about, what exam you're talking about, so give me some details and let me know who you are, right? You'll see my fictional email address is a little weird. I guess this is also my chance to say, this is the beginning of your college career. I would suggest using your Hunter email address as much as you possibly can as you go through your career. It's kind of the beginning of your professional life in some ways. And you don't want to be applying for jobs and talking to your professors with an email address like that, right? So just try to be a little bit of professional and organize your emails, punctuation, all of that stuff. That, if nothing else, that communicates to me that you've thought about the material and you're trying to meet me halfway as you're asking me to do something for you, right? Right. So, okay. That's kind of the beginning. I don't know if there are any questions. We have a lot of time to answer these. I can answer them via email and all that. That's kind of the preamble, right? All of the organizational aspects of the course. So I guess I can kind of dive into the usual first day sort of material. And I guess you do this in every subject. You say, well, what is this all about here? What is economics? Well, it's kind of an interesting question, and it's sort of a long and interesting story. In fact, I have a whole class I teach about what economics is. That's the history of thought class. A short answer is that, this has changed over time in a rather important way in the past maybe 100 years or so. And I think people tend to think about economics in this previous way. I say before, right, economics was defined by subject matter. So you think about economics as studying the economy, right? Studying a market, right? I don't know what you're talking about, the market for oil, or the market for automobiles, or the labor market, something like that, right? That might be how you thought about economics, and it certainly is how the profession used to think about itself X amount of years ago. But really, it's more defined by its method, right? By the way we attack problems when we think about things from an economic perspective, right? What is this method? I'll get to that. Right? I'm building suspense here. I will say also that economics is rather unique in the social sciences in that it's unified in this basic methodology. That is to say, almost 99 out of 100 economists will agree that will agree about what the economic method is and how to attack a problem. I mean, implementation will differ, but we'll all pretty much agree about what the method is. It turns out that economics also, unified in its methodology, it's also relatively sophisticated, or at least it can be in terms of its mathematics and statistics, right? But when you combine these two things, I'll talk a little bit about this today, method and statistical methodology, you get this rather interesting traveling STEM subject that as I've described it here. And maybe you can even see that in some of the research that I've discussed, some of my ideas, economic anthropology and law and economics. And indeed, you can study all sorts of things. You can study world development. You can study history. You can even bring economics to philosophy or study the health and medicine. All of these things. Of course, I know a lot of you, I left out the obvious one, finance, banking, and things like that, right, or also fall under the purview of economics. So there's this whole wealth of things you can study with the methods we'll talk about. And maybe it's a good idea to just have I'm going to kind of do this in a just overview of some of the things that people are working on. It occurred to me that I put this slide in and I haven't previewed it yet, so it might be, we'll see how it goes. But let me, so one of the most popular places people go to find information about what's going on in the world of economic research is the so-called MBER website here, which is the National Bureau of Economic Research. And you can see here that there's all kinds of economic subjects that you can read about that people are doing research on, right? So we have retirement and disability. We have markups in consumer preferences, right? That has to do with the things you buy and the way firms mark up the products they sell you. Incarceration, employment, and earnings, right? How are those things related? Incentives for charitable giving. Let's see, I'll give you one more here. Oh, and even something on the economics of education here, the effects of Texas's top 10% college admissions plan, right? That's this plan they have in Texas where the top 10% of students in any class can go to the University of Texas, I guess. Okay, so that's a pretty nice variety of subjects, some of which might interest you. I can this is, I guess, current stuff. I can go back in history, and this is a little hard to see. Let me see if I can zoom in here. These are the top 25. I'm going to go to top 100. This is a website called RepEc, which is basically a repository for almost everything that's ever happened in economics in the publishing world. And these are the most downloaded papers of all time, journal articles. Let's go all time here. Okay. So you can see here, for those of you who are interested in finance, maybe there's good news. Number 2 is the pricing of options and corporate liabilities, right? Options pricing. Number 3 is prospect theory, which has to do with this field of behavioral economics. That's this paper right here. Going down a little bit further, corruption and growth. Interesting subject there. I'm trying to find, let's see here. A theory of rational addiction, right? That's interesting. And we have down here a theory of marriage, right? The economics of marriage. So now we have economics getting into, I guess, deeper issues of psychology and familial organization. So since it's my class, I get to just toot my own horn a little bit here. And I thought I would just give you some examples of things that I've worked on. One of which is this paper here, which is on Civil War surgery. Right? You might be wondering what the heck that has to do with economics. And I asked this question: was Civil War surgery effective? Right? That is you probably have seen the movies and heard the things about in the Civil War how the doctors were effectively killing people. More on that in a second. So that I can take some economic methods and look at that problem. One of my other recent papers is here. This is with my colleague Lisa George. And it's the NewsHour welfare estimation in the market for local television news. Right? So this is about a completely different thing. Is there enough local news? Too much? Too little? How would you know, right? But it's something that people care about a little bit, especially as everything becomes national and newspapers fail and all of that stuff. Local papers disappear. My third example here is an example from hunter-gatherer societies, believe it or not. And it's called an equilibrium conflict model of land tenure, that is to say, land ownership. Now, what the heck does that have to do with economics? Well, when you decide to own land and you decide to, I guess, own anything, all sorts of things happen, right? It gives you incentives to change your behavior, but other people look at what you have and maybe decide they want to try to take it, right? When you sort out all of these competing incentives, right, to own things and to sort of undermine ownership, what happens? Do you wind up with things being owned or things being shared? To what degree are they owned? And so I'm able to actually develop an economic theory, what is that again, that shows how you can actually sort of look at land ownership patterns across societies, right, hunter-gatherer societies, and it kind of makes sense from this economic perspective. So that's interesting. I have my I'm going to come back to the Civil War thing in a second. Here's my, this was I enjoyed it putting this paper together. You can see there's maps and table, there's a nice map I drew, so it's a lot of fun. Anyway, put it back here. So everything I've said here proceeds from this basic premise that we adopt as economists, which is, unfortunately, there's a blue line running through it, so let me kind of do this, is that people make decisions, right, that we're thinking about decisions and why people make the decisions that they do. And what we assume is that decision makers are confronted with scarcity, right? That is to say, not everything is possible, right? When you take some things, you'll give up others, put another way. And what they do then is make rational decisions when facing these choices, right? Important choices governed by scarcity. And of course, maybe this raises more questions than it answers for you. Who is a decision maker, right? What does it mean to be rational when you make a decision, right? And, well, let me move on here. So when we say things are scarce, what we really mean is that all important decisions involve trade-offs. You can't do everything, right? When you can't do everything, what do, right? Well, one thing implied by scarcity is that we have to think about the value of different alternatives. And so whenever you choose one thing, right, what you give up, the costs of choosing one thing are the value that you give up that you could have gotten from doing something else. This is the principle of opportunity cost, right? A key component of economics, right? And when you think about things this way, basically almost every action you take is costly, right, in one way or another. Right, and this, of course, I mentioned here in my example, when you, say, decide to go to college, there are several costs to this. Some of these are direct, right? You have to spend $75 on Top Hat, pay tuition, bus fare, subway fare to get here. But there are other things, other costs you incur as well, right? You could be working, maybe, and earning money. That's a cost as well, right? And so, presumably, an economist would say that you've made a rational decision to come to college, right? The things that you're foregoing, the money you're spending right now, and the money that you could be earning that you're not, well, when you choose college, that somehow the value of college, right, that you'll get is greater than the value that you could have gotten from those other things, right? That's an example of a rational decision. So people use this information about relative values, right, this myriad of information, and then they make their best decisions that way, right? And so, maybe I say it in a slide. I have this habit of sometimes getting ahead of my slides. These decision makers can be just about anyone. Maybe you kind of got this from some of the things that I discussed earlier. This doesn't just have to be you deciding to go to college. It can be people deciding about what healthcare plan to purchase. It can be businesses deciding what combination of products to produce or where they should procure their inputs in production. It can even be governments. Right? A government can be a rational decision maker, in which case the government might have different objectives. Right? The government might be making rational decisions to try and maximize the welfare of its citizens. It might be trying to maximize its own consumption, right? Kind of like a kleptocracy. We have examples of both of those things. The point is that we can posit that people make rational decisions, and we can think about this well-defined objective that people pursue when they make these decisions. And so this idea you might be saying, well, so what? It turns out that I have an example for you later, but this idea gets really exciting when we combine this idea with a little bit of technique, right? And indeed, when we start talking about markets and all of these things, you'll see that the technical side, when wedded with this idea of rational decisions, becomes a really interesting vehicle for thinking about these things. Okay, I'll get to that in a second. So let me just circle back here and tell you why, when you think about these things, rational decisions and how people make them, how that could actually be used to think about the effectiveness of surgery, not just in my example, but in general. And so here's an interesting thing about this is from this book called The Medical History of the Civil War, which is an enormous, it's thousands of pages, and it has enormous amounts of information. And so you can see here, these are all the sorts of injuries that people suffered, right? And you can see we have this information on how often surgery was applied. And then you can see I have recovery rates, right? So one thing might jump out at you, I've broken down the recovery rates by surgery or not, right? One thing might jump out at you by looking at this data, right? Anybody, is there something interesting? If anybody has an observation, throw it out there. What do you notice about the recovery rates for those who didn't get surgery and those who did? Yes? Yeah, so the observation is that if you look at the people who got surgery, it seems like it's more often the case that the recovery rate is lower than those who didn't, right? So, I mean, look at this, the patella, knee joint, right? 71% of those who did not get surgery recovered. 35% of those who did recovered. That's not great, right? It looks like if you were to look at this data and think about it, you'd say, well, the doctors are killing their patients, quite literally, right? And most people these days haven't seen the movie Dances with Wolves, but there's a very famous scene, where the hero of the movie is, gets wounded in this battle, and manages to get the hell away from the surgeon before the surgeon chops off his leg. Okay. Well, is that what's going on? I don't know. You might think so if surgeons operated randomly, but they do not, right? By the way, this isn't just a feature of, I'm being a little dramatic here, this isn't just Civil War data. If you look at surgical data in general, it often has this characteristic. Recovery rates seem lower among those who actually get surgery. Well, no, right? The problem is that doctors are rational actors, right? And they operate in pursuit of a fairly well-defined objective, right? Which is they want their patients to survive, maybe. We can assume that, right? And what decisions do they make? Well, in the Civil War in particular, they had scarce resources to allocate, right? Their time. Particularly in a big battle, you can't operate on everyone. So who do you operate on first when confronted with this scarcity? I think someone said it. Yes?
The people who have the worst injuries?
Probably the people who have the worst injuries, right? And so this is what we call a selection into treatment effect, right? And it's an outcome that derives from doctors pursuing their craft rationally, right? And so, right, someone comes in with a horrific knee injury, right, and they're hemorrhaging blood, you might operate there, and if someone just has a scrape, you wouldn't. And so that will be one reason why these recovery rates look the way they do. So, of course, that's an interesting observation, right? And then you might wonder how, as an economist, if you're trying to assess the effectiveness of not just surgery but anything, how you grapple with this, right? This fact that people are rationally making decisions about how to apply their craft behind the scenes. That's a big subject, and that's one that I don't know if we'll fully get to it in this class, but one that down the road you could talk about in your econometrics class. But you can see it has rather profound implications. In this case, it's of historical interest, but if you were trying to understand surgery and its effectiveness, it would be something you have to think about, right? The treatment is not random. Okay. And if you ever want to talk about how I sort of actually think about that a little bit, and I find that actually surgery was effective, and it did increase the chances of patient survival. Okay, well, one thing this is something about economics I've been grappling with maybe my entire career, is that it has this sort of dual nature. Right? Economics, in some ways, is like an engineering subject, right? Or maybe like physics, where you take a simple principle and you take some math, and then you bring these tools to a specific problem. I have an example in a second. And then, this sort of implies that, oh, well, now that we know what the basic mechanics of the situation are, we can manipulate it to our advantage, right? That's kind of the principle behind policy, right? So that's kind of the physics, right, side. And indeed, one thing you can actually show is that economics tries to, as it progresses over the years and centuries, has tried to very much emulate physics, right? Simple laws, simple rules that govern everything. But there's also a big philosophical and maybe even a biological component to economics, right? That things are very complex, right? A market, right? And how people interact in a market is a very complex thing, right? And whenever you mess around with it, it's a little bit like an ecosystem, right? You can change one little thing about it, but then there'll be this whole sequence of unintended consequences, right? And so this leads to some rather large, dramatic questions when you think about this philosophical aspect and this complexity aspect to economics, right? So we have kind of oversimplification, but then this acknowledgement of complexity. Well, we'll get into these. Before I get to, maybe we'll talk about I'm struggling here in front of you all about how to best do this. I'm going to talk about a little bit of an example here of an engineering kind of problem that we might pursue in economics. And we'll have a lot of occasions to do this. And this is an example for how economists use this technique of revealed preference and a little bit of math, right? A little bit of technique. And we bring them to bear on this concept of a statistical value of a human life here. So. All right, so the first thing we might want to do, we're going to keep this idea in mind that people are rational, right? Rational actors. But by the same token, we're going to introduce a technical concept here that we can sort of wed to this idea that people are rational. So, our particular case, the technical concept is expected value. Is anybody familiar with the concept of expected value? Right, so this is something like when you have a probabilistic outcome, or when you have something that could happen with uncertainty, or there's some probability of different outcomes, it's on average what you expect to get out of it, right? And how you compute this. So, a very rough example. Let's suppose you and I play a game where we flip a coin, right? 1/2 is the probability of it coming up heads or tails. If it comes up heads, right? I give you $10. If it comes up tails, you give me $10, right? So, I guess it's a simple question. On average, maybe you can work it through in your head. What would you expect to earn playing such a game? 0, right? If you and I played this game over and over again, you would probably win half of the time, and I would probably win half of the time, and our earnings would cancel out. We would say that game has an expected value of 0, right? Well, it turns out there's a very simple way of computing, right, expected value. And basically what you do is you take the monetary outcome, $10 or negative $10 from your perspective, and then you multiply it by the probability that outcome happens. So 1/2 times 10, negative 1/2 times, 1/2 times negative 10, right? Notice those probabilities add up to 1. 1/2 plus 1/2. And then what you do is you just add up the results, right? So the formula for expected value looks something like this. You don't need to know this. I'm never going to test you on this, and we'll get a simple version anyway. That's a summation sign, right? And the PI/XI means the probability of I happening, and XI is the return in that instance. If we think about my simple example, what this says is it would be 0.5 times 10 plus 0.5 or 1/2 times minus 10. This is obviously 5 plus minus 5, which is 0, right? And maybe we can, we'll consider a variation on the theme. Let's have a little bit fun here. Maybe, it's this time of year where the NFL season is about to get rolling, that glorious time of year. And so there's a lot of gambling, you may or may not know, around football. One bet, I'm just making this up, that we might make, maybe you and I make this bet, is you say, well, I'll tell you what, if the Giants win more than 9 games or more, right? You give me $100, Baker, and if they win less than 9 games, I'll give you $100, right? And I say, well, that's interesting, and so on and so forth. And let's suppose you've assessed or figured out somehow that the probability of this happening is 0.6 or 60%. There's a 60% chance the Giants win 9 games or more. Now we might ask, what is the expected value of that bet, right? So the way we would do this is, from your perspective, you would say, well, let's see, with probability 0.6, I win. In that event, I get $100, right? Well, I win with probability 0.6. That means I lose with probability 0.4, right? The probabilities always add to 1. I probably should have said that without just assuming, but it seems like most people. So with probability of 0.4, right, I lose $100. Now, you can kind of just do this math. 60 minus 40 equals 20. You can see here that now the expected value of this bet is $20. So once again, that's not maybe the best prediction as to how much you're going to win, but it says if you were to repeat this over and over again, you would on average have winnings of $20, right? That's kind of what the expected value is. And notice in this case, we might use it as a guide to decision making, right? So for example, I offer you this bet, right? You might be inclined to take it. Why? Because, well, you win it more often than you lose it, right? It has a positive expected value. So now it becomes this guide to decision making. So let's parlay this into what is it, 140? Okay. We can parlay this into some more interesting maybe concepts. One of which kind of figures rather largely into the economics of insurance, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, let's consider an example. I'll consider a home insurance example. Suppose you own a beach house, right? I have your favorite location. How about the Outer Banks of North Carolina, maybe? There's a lot of stormy activity there. Maybe statistics show that, every 20 years or so, there's a 1 in 20 chance or a 5% chance, 0.05% chance of an accident, right, occurring. And let's suppose that in the event of an accident, I'll call that P, the probability of accident. It's 0.05, right? Let's suppose in the event of an accident, $100,000 worth of damage will be done to your house, right? Well, what we might want to do, or what we could do, is maybe you're trying to figure out your finances or whatever over time, you could think about the expected damages that you will sustain over time, right? And the way you might do this is you might say, well, let's see, 5% of the time I experience a loss of $100,000. Well, 95% of the time then, right, 1 minus 0.05, nothing happens. I don't have a loss, right? So over time, what is my expected loss? Well, let's see here. We can just follow the recipe, 0.0 times 100,000 plus 0.95 times 0. Well, that's nice, because anything times 0 is 0, right? So this kind of goes away, and we arrive at $5,000. So, incidentally, this is kind of how insurance works. It turns out people like to avoid risks, and it also turns out that this is kind of a fair amount, right, to charge for insurance. So essentially what you might do is you'd say, well, I'll pay $5,000, my expected damages every year, to an insurance company, and then in the 1 in 20 years where something happens, they'll give me back $100,000, right? In which case, when an accident happens, this is kind of 0 too, right? I just get my $100,000 back, but I pay this every year. And that's kind of the organizing principle beyond insurance. So I've gone overboard with this. That's way too much. If you didn't get it, it's fine. One more thing. We can even use this method now to back out, maybe discover some things that might surprise you a little bit. So here's a scenario. Let's suppose that, we bought a new car not too long ago. Let's suppose I go into the dealership and I'm buying a new car and all that stuff, and we get to that part where the dealer says, all right, well, we got some extras that might interest you. Would you like the great sound system, the sunroof? Oh, we also have this feature. It's a new type of airbag. I'm making this up, by the way. This didn't actually happen. It's this new type of airbag or seatbelt, right? We've run all the numbers and all of that, and we can say that people who do this, buy this thing, right, they experience a reduction, right, in the probability of being killed in a car accident, right, of about 1/1000%, right? And I say, well, what does that mean? Does that mean if I get in an accident? They say, no, just in general. Right, factoring in the probability you get into accidents and all of that stuff, you have about a slightly smaller chance of being killed in one of these accidents. And I say, oh, well, that's, geez, how much is it? And the dealer says, well, it's $1,000. And I say, screw that, I'm not buying that. $1,000, 1/1000%. And maybe I say, yeah, it's the typical dealership trying to get me to spend on the things I don't need, blah, blah, blah. But an economist would look at this and say, wow, Baker has revealed something very interesting here about the value he places on something. So let's call this value V, right? And we will observe that what I've done is change the expected value of this V by 0.001, right? So what I'm talking about here is the value I place on my own life. So if we think about the expected savings, right, well, what they are here are P, that change in probability, times V. We don't know what it is yet, right? So I'm going to write this in here as P, oh boy, 1/1000th. It's like that, right? We have this here as the change that I experience, right? That I guess you could say, the gain I would experience if I were to buy this thing, right? Well, a rational decision maker makes rational decisions, right? I didn't buy it. So what we can do is we can infer that this cost, this potential loss, was less than the loss I would spend right now up front, right? Remember what that was, $1,000, right? So we now arrive at this inequality here, right? Where we've now set things up so we can suppose, by using this assumption that Baker was rational in his decision to buy extras on his car, you might quibble with that, but if you let me run with it, then we can just kind of do the algebra here. And I think this is 1 million, right? So we've now been able to sort of say, well, evidently Baker places places a value somewhere less than $1 million on his life. Right? And this is, by the way, how economists discover this idea, or how they inform this idea, I should say, of the statistical value of a human life. Right? By looking at decisions people make in these probabilistic situations and backing out the variables. Right? And once again, just notice, I'm not trying here to teach you about expected values. I'm just trying to show you how you can wed a technical concept, right, to this assumption of rationality, and learn something about the situation that might not otherwise be obvious, right? Okay, well, that's kind of an engineering thing. We can also talk about some of these bigger questions, right? And indeed, maybe this is really the key aspect of the course, and discovering just how these two things are interrelated, I should say, is also a big aspect. Well, some of the age-old questions people have always asked about our, I guess you could say, economic system in general, right? Which is about a couple of things. It's about producing stuff, right? Deciding what to produce, right? How to produce it, and then deciding how to distribute what is produced. Right? So some of the biggest philosophers over time have kind of thought about this problem. Plato, if you read The Republic, has a description of what he thinks the optimal way to organize production is. More famously, Karl Marx, right, argues that production should be rearranged in a certain way, and that there are things about it that aren't fair. Adam Smith, of course, has a different view. He wrote The Wealth of Nations. We'll be talking a little bit about that. Walt Disney, I guess, is the weirder name on this list, right? And it turns out Walt Disney had a vision of how the world should be organized based on economics and production and distribution. So if you've ever been to Epcot, people, Epcot? All right, a lot of people. So I went there with this was many years ago. I think my kids, I have 3 kids. You'll be hearing a lot about them for better, for worse over the semester. They've kind of aged out of the Disneyland, Disney World thing. So, but we did go to Epcot, which was fun. But then if you start going on the rides at Epcot, I don't know if anybody's done that. The thing about those rides is they're very strange. Right? You sit in this like pod and you go through like this thing where you get to see Walt Disney's vision as to how you could organize a town. It's like this big circle, and everybody lives on the outside and then travels in and then does research on seeds and stuff. And it's a utopian vision as to how we should organize society, right? And so we have a lot to say about that. We will over the course of the semester. And one of the themes that we'll pursue with this goal in mind is understanding the interaction between what's best for you and what's best for the society, right? And indeed, we will be asking this question. Everybody doing the best for themselves, self-interest, what does that have to do with the objectives of society, what we're trying to achieve as a society? In particular, how do these goals gel? How do they run against one another, right? Are there conflicts of interest between the individual behavior and social objectives? Indeed, Karl Marx would certainly say there were, right? So that's one interesting question that we can get when we think about these big questions. Another side question here, related question, is about value. I put this up here as a separate point because people have very conflicting notions about value. They think some things are valuable but have low prices or cheap. Some things are not very valuable but are very expensive. I don't know. Where does value come from? Well, this is an age-old question that people have been wrestling with since time immemorial, and we'll have a lot to say about that, right? Once again, back to the ancient Greeks and probably different, further back than that. And so then you sort of get into these questions about what is fair, right? And when you kind of put all those things together, you're saying, well, some things are valuable. We're trying to accomplish certain objectives as a society. What does it mean to be fair, right? And indeed, people have thought a wide variety of market activities or economic activities aren't fair. So we, of course, today talk about fair trade, but back even in the Middle Ages, or back even further, charging interest for money at all was thought to be unfair, right? It's thought to be inherently wrong, right, or immoral. So, interesting. Well, what I'm sort of hoping to show you or convince you of is that if you sort of take, thinking about all of those things together, it turns out a market-based economy, or markets in general, tend to do a pretty good job, just in terms of organizing economic activity. That is to say, if you think about what we produce as a society, who gets it, right? What products are created and developed and all of that stuff. A market economy, in spite of its inherent or apparent chaos, right? Everybody just doing what they want to, what's best for them, actually does a very good job of meeting any sort of societal objectives we might have. I might even argue better than any possible alternative, demonstrably better, right? It also turns out that exchange and trade, right, plays a rather interesting and obvious role in promoting good social outcomes, right? And maybe even some other things that might surprise you that someone would say this. Not only are markets effective, but they are actually quite fair, right, in determining who gets what. That might, strike you as not true at all, but I'm hoping to demonstrate for you at least why you might think it to be true. And it also turns out that markets usually work in such a way so that the value of goods is accurately reflected. That is to say, the actual value of goods is reflected. So I have a very, maybe, I'm trying to get you out of here a little bit early. It's the first day, and that's kind of the custom among professors, is to not beat the students down on the first day too much. So maybe I'll just go through this quick example. And we'll think about, I know our textbook costs $75 and all that stuff, but think about this example. Let's suppose someone took my class last semester, say, and they still have the textbook. I know I don't have it's a hypothetical example. Our textbook is all on Top Hat. And so this person, having taken the class, likes having an econ book laying around maybe, but doesn't need it every day. So the valuation is $10. Where did I get that number, by the way? We're going to learn about that too, is how you might produce such numbers, the value that someone places. But just suppose we have it, $10. Now someone else, maybe someone like yourself, is just taking this class now and therefore needs a book, wants a book, values having a book at $50, right? So we have this difference in valuation between these two uses. Now a perfectly reasonable thing might be to think about some price between those two, right? $30 in my example here, and then think about what happens. So $30, these two parties trade this product. So the person selling the book gives up something they value at $10 and gets $30 back, right? They get $20, right? Meanwhile, the person buying the book gets something worth $50 and gives up $30, right? I get something worth $50 for $30. I get $20 too, right? So in some sense, each person gains $20 from this exchange, right? Both parties benefit. Notice also that when the book goes from the first person to the second, we can think about this as the good flowing to its highest value use, right? It goes from someone who valued it at 10 to someone who values it at 50. That's an improvement, I guess, in the conditions of society. If you sort of think about this playing out over and over again. But you can see how this market transaction, A, allows the good to flow from a low value use to a high value use, right? And of course, the example can be made more complex. We can imagine that the first person, say, can produce the good at a cost of $10 and then sell it at $30 to someone who values it at $50. That's kind of like a market transaction where the exact same thing happens. But now it's resources being put together and flowing to a higher value use. So, and indeed, you can see here 50 minus 10 is 40. In my simple market transaction here, that $40 of gain has been split among the people, right, the buyers and sellers there, right, based on the market price. And so that's kind of, I don't know if that's obvious, if that's mundane, or if you find that interesting, but that is really writ large one of the basic principles of economics, is that trades produce value for both participants. So this is even true in some situations that might make you feel a little weird for reasons I don't really have to go, we can go into it at a later date. I have an example here about a retail outfit, $10. I'm assuming your time is worth a lot more than that. but just bear with me for the sake of argument. You value your time at $10, right? A retail store needs someone to man the operation, and maybe on net, when it's open, it brings in, sells a bunch of merchandise, pays some bills, but it gets about $300 an hour when there's someone working there. So when they pay you $20, they obviously realize $280 and from this gain, right, of $290 total dollars, and you get $10 in, I guess we can call it surplus, right? You're giving up your time you valued at 10 to get 20. They're buying your time at a cost of 20 to get 300. And indeed, the basic nature of that transaction hasn't changed, but I put this example up here so you can think about it a little bit. Is there something weird about that example? Does it seem like the business is making too much? I don't know. We'll talk about these and other things over the course of the semester. So, just some basic bookkeeping. We do not have class Monday, right? That's Labor Day, right? So I won't see you in a week. Way back at the beginning of class, I mentioned these two things that you could do. It says homework 1 on Top Hat. It's really just, can you log onto the internet and click on some things, right? It's pretty simple. You don't even have to have it done by next class. Really what I'm hoping you do is maybe you sign up for Top Hat, get the 14-day grace period going, poke around a little bit, nothing serious. Next time we'll start talking about, the end of the slides here, economic models, right? That is to say, these general technical tools which we use to organize our ideas and how we can use them, right? And so I will see you then.